He didn't see the scars. That was the problem. Dr. Sterling walked past the newest nurse on his unit like she was furniture, which was exactly how Katie Morrison preferred it. Invisible. Forgettable. The kind of floor nurse who reorganized supply carts and checked vital signs and vanished when the real doctors needed to talk. He didn't see the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, SEAL Team 5, Marja, 2010. He didn't see the way her left hand moved with precision despite a tremor that appeared only when she thought no one was watching. Mercy General's emergency department in Norfolk hummed with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday afternoon, fluorescent lights casting everything in a sterile white glow that made shadows look sinister. Katie moved through it like water finding the lowest point, her stethoscope around her neck, her scrubs immaculate, her eyes downcast in a way that had taken her 17 years to master. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and floor wax and something underneath, the particular odor of money moving in directions it shouldn't. She had been at Mercy General for exactly 2 weeks. 14 days of watching. 14 days of learning the rhythms of a place that ran on something other than medical protocol. The equipment contracts, for instance. Katie had heard Dr. Sterling on the phone in the hallway outside the supply closet, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone used to being obeyed. 20% above market rate for ventilators. Phantom billing codes that appeared on invoices but never on patient charts. Phantom billing codes that required silence from staff who knew how to look the other way. The cafeteria staff knew. The respiratory therapists knew. The housekeeping crew definitely knew. Katie had watched them exchange a look when Sterling walked past with his $4,000 leather briefcase. The kind of look that meant everyone was complicit or everyone was quiet, and in institutional environments, those amounted to the same thing. Katie reorganized the supply cart on the 3rd floor with methodical care. 2 units of whole blood, check. 3 units of fresh frozen plasma, check. Sterile 16-gauge needles arranged in ascending order, because order was how you survived when chaos came looking. Her fingers moved with the economy of motion that came from muscle memory measured in sand dunes and moonlight, from field hospitals where one mistake meant someone's child never came home. She pulled on her jacket, standard issue hospital issue, nothing remarkable, and her fingers found the patch sewn deep inside the lining. SEAL Team 5. Marja. 2010. Her thumb traced the embroidered trident once, then she let her hand fall. Ghosts didn't wear name tags. Ghosts didn't ask questions about inflated contracts. Ghosts moved through the world quietly and hurt no one and eventually stopped existing altogether, which had always been the plan. Down the hallway in room 14, a gurney sat at a precise angle, the kind of angle chosen by nurses who understood spatial efficiency. Commander James Riker lay on the hospital bed with his eyes fixed on the ceiling tile, his pupils responding sluggishly to light. He'd been pulled from the water 4 days ago, the official story claimed. Pulled from the water with injuries sustained in Marja that had required a 7-hour surgical intervention and 3 units of packed red blood cells. His chart sat in the slot outside his door marked classified personnel, authorized clearance only, which meant half the hospital had looked at it and none of them had asked questions. The name Morrison was tattooed on his left forearm in bold letters, dark blue ink that had seen as much of Marja as Katie had. She saw it when she passed his door. She saw it and her stomach made a small, trained movement, neither up nor down, neither present nor past. Just acknowledgement. Just the body knowing something the mind wasn't yet permitted to confirm. Katie's eyes flicked to him for half a second as she passed room 14. No more. The eyes met his for a fraction of a moment, then away. She had learned how to compress entire conversations into looks that lasted less than a heartbeat. The commander's eyes were the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic, and they were looking at her with the peculiar focus of someone whose brain wasn't quite working right. His jaw was bandaged. His left arm lay across his stomach with the careful precision of someone protecting something broken. Katie kept walking. Ghosts didn't stop. Ghosts didn't look back. The main doors opened at 2:33 p.m. with the sound of expensive shoes clicking against cold tile. Dr. Sterling entered the department like a man entering a room he owned, which he essentially did. His residents trailed behind him in a loose formation, their white coats moving with the fluid precision of apex predators following the alpha. Sterling moved through the space with a confidence that came from knowing exactly which administrators he had dinner with, exactly which hospital board members' children attended his country club, exactly which contracts would be renewed if he kept the staff quiet and productive. His eyes landed on Katie with the calculating precision of a man assessing prey. She was reorganizing the crash cart. Again. The same woman who'd been reorganizing it 6 times a day for 2 weeks, checking the defibrillator pads, counting the epinephrine doses, moving 4 pumps with the care of someone who believed equipment mattered. Sterling had watched her type before. The nervous ones. The ones who were terrified of making mistakes. The ones who jumped when he entered a room and kept their eyes down and didn't ask inconvenient questions about why the billing codes didn't match the actual patient care. The ones who'd be gone in a week once they realized that working in his unit meant choosing between your conscience and your paycheck. Katie felt him watching before she saw him. It was a sensation that came from 17 years of learning to read rooms before the shooting started, a shift in air pressure, a change in the electromagnetic frequency of threat. She didn't look up. Looking up would be a mistake. Looking up would give him something to work with. Instead, she continued her work with mechanical precision, checking the monitor leads one more time, ensuring the defibrillator pads were arranged in the correct order, making herself into the kind of background presence that disappeared when you stopped looking at it. Morrison. Sterling's voice carried the particular weight of a man used to speaking and being obeyed immediately. It was the kind of voice that had ordered supply contracts that didn't exist and billing codes that evaporated like water on hot asphalt. A word. Katie turned. Her face was composed. Her shoulders were loose. Her hands hung at her sides with the kind of perfect stillness that came from years of standing at attention while mortar rounds walked across a compound 200 meters away. This was the composure style she'd chosen for this life, stoic. Unwavering. The kind of presence that acknowledged an order without acknowledging the person giving it. Dr. Sterling. 2 words. Respectful tone. Eyes meeting his, then appropriately away. Not confrontational. Not submissive. Just professional. Just the baseline acknowledgement of hierarchy in an institutional setting. The nurse acknowledging the physician. Nothing more. Sterling smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. His residents shifted slightly, recognizing the tell that their supervisor was about to demonstrate something about the proper management of subordinate staff. Sterling moved closer, close enough that Katie could smell his cologne, something expensive and assertive, the olfactory equivalent of a $40,000 watch. I trust the supply organization is meeting your exacting standards. There was mockery in the question. There was the particular tone of someone who had watched her meticulously arrange equipment 6 times a day and decided it was a character flaw worth highlighting in front of witnesses. Katie registered it. Noted it. Filed it away in the same mental compartment where she kept all the other data points about institutional threat assessment. Equipment saves lives when it's organized correctly. Her voice was quiet. Not deferential. Just factual. Just the statement of a person who had held people together using medical supplies and moonlight and will. Disorganized equipment kills people. Sterling's smile tightened. He wasn't used to floor nurses making statements about their work as though it carried professional weight. He wasn't used to being corrected, even gently, by staff he considered interchangeable. But that wasn't the worst part. What he didn't know was that the woman standing in front of him had performed emergency pericardiocentesis in a field clinic with nothing but a 16-gauge needle and moonlight. What he didn't know was that the patch sewn inside her jacket lining represented the kind of operational experience that made organized supply carts look like the difference between life and death. What he didn't know was that the commander in room 14 had the word Morrison tattooed on his forearm for a reason, and that reason was walking past his door 6 times a shift checking vital signs with the care of someone who had already carried him bleeding through 200 meters of Taliban crossfire. Sterling's residents waited for him to dismiss her, to make some cutting remark that would establish once more that this unit operated by his rules and his standards. Instead, he simply gestured with one hand toward the supply cart, a movement that was somehow both dismissive and commanding. Continue your hobby. And Morrison? Next time someone wants to reorganize anything in my unit, they ask first. We have protocols. He turned away. His residents followed him like planets orbiting a sun that was about to go supernova. Katie watched them go, then returned to the supply cart with the same methodical precision she'd brought to it before. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't betray anything except the professional focus of a nurse ensuring that life-saving equipment was arranged correctly. The hospital hummed around her. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric song. Somewhere down the hallway, a monitor beeped its rhythm. In room 14, Commander Riker stared at the ceiling and his brain worked slowly through the puzzle of a name on a forehead, of a woman's footsteps passing his door, of something his concussed mind couldn't quite assemble into understanding. Katie moved through the ER like she was part of the infrastructure now. Like she belonged here. Like she had nothing to hide and nowhere to run and no secret sewn into the lining of her jacket that would change everything the moment anyone decided to look closely enough. The crash cart was perfect now. She was good at making things perfect. She was good at disappearing. She was good at waiting. All she had to do was survive long enough for someone else to need what she could do, and then every choice she'd made about who to become in this hospital would either matter or it wouldn't. But that wasn't today. Today was just another shift at Mercy General in Norfolk, in Dr. Sterling's kingdom, where the quiet ones reorganized equipment and kept their secrets and tried very hard not to exist. The cafeteria at Mercy General smelled like industrial floor wax and reheated chicken, that particular combination of hospital food that never quite smelled fresh no matter what the menu promised. Katie Morrison stood at the beverage station, her hand frozen on the coffee pot, when Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the afternoon noise like a blade through silk. He leaned against the doctor's table, surrounded by 5 surgical residents, his voice pitched loud enough to carry across 3 tables worth of staff. $20 says the timid little floor nurse quits within a week when she sees how real medicine works here, Sterling announced, his laugh a sharp bark that made the residents lean in closer. She looks like she might cry if someone raises their voice. The residents laughed. One of them, a second-year fellow with the kind of arrogance that only came from never being told no, slapped the table. Katie didn't flinch. She poured her coffee with a steady hand, watching the dark liquid fill her mug in a thin stream. A single tear escaped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it immediately. She let it fall to her collarbone, then wiped it with the back of her hand without looking up, without changing her breathing, without giving Sterling the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. But Sterling saw. He grinned wider, the expression of a man who believed he had already won. He passed her on his way to the hall, and his shoulder came up, not accidentally, not even close, connecting with her lunch tray hard enough to send it spinning. The apple rolled under a table. The soup splashed across the tile in a rust-colored arc plastic silverware scattered like shrapnel. The sound echoed through the cafeteria. Conversations died. Sterling didn't stop walking. "Oh, sorry Nightingale, didn't see you there," he called over his shoulder, his voice dripping with false concern. "Maybe try taking up more space." Katie crouched slowly. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, the kind of careful motion that came from years of operating under fire where panic and speed got people killed. She picked up the apple. The spoon. The tray. The other nurses watched her in that uncomfortable silence that happened when someone was being publicly dismantled and nobody had the courage to intervene. She stood, balanced the cleaned-up tray against her hip, and met Sterling's eyes without blinking. Her voice came out so calm it made the entire cafeteria go still. "I've picked up heavier things than paperwork, Doctor." Sterling's expression flickered. His jaw tightened. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, he couldn't quite find a response to something so perfectly delivered, so utterly composed. He turned and walked away, and Katie could feel the weight of his confusion like a physical pressure against her spine. The residents exchanged glances. The attending physicians looked away. And Katie Morrison carried her tray to the trash, emptied it, and clocked back in for the rest of her shift like nothing had happened. But that wasn't the worst part. An hour later, she brought Sterling his discharge charts, the ones he needed to sign for 3 patients being released that afternoon. He was at the nurse's station with 2 attendings reviewing a surgical schedule for the following week, their heads bent over a tablet, marking blocks of time with the casual certainty of men who believed the system existed to serve them. Katie approached and held out the charts. Sterling didn't look up. He didn't acknowledge her presence. He simply reached out, took the papers from her hand, and threw them downward with enough force to scatter them across the floor like leaves. Papers skidded under the desk. One caught on the corner of a rolling chair. Another landed face down in a wet spot of coffee that had been there since morning. Sterling snapped his fingers twice, a gesture so deliberately demeaning that the attending beside him actually shifted his weight, a small tell of discomfort that Sterling didn't notice because he was too busy enjoying himself. "Pick those up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice carrying the kind of false patience someone used with children or animals. "Organizational skills aren't optional here. Maybe nursing school didn't cover filing." The attendings exchanged glances. One of them cleared his throat. Neither of them said anything. Katie took one measured breath. One breath was all she needed. One tear tracked down her cheek, and she let it, because sometimes showing a crack was exactly what kept people from looking deeper. She wiped it with the back of her hand, crouched to the floor, and began gathering the papers in perfect order, organizing them by patient name, then by date, then by procedure type. Her hands moved with the precise efficiency of someone who had performed far more complex operations in far worse conditions. She assembled the charts into a single stack, tapped them against her thigh to align the edges, and stood. When she placed them on the desk in front of Sterling, her eyes held his for exactly 3 seconds of absolute stillness. No anger. No resentment. Just the calm, measured gaze of someone looking at a problem they had already solved 1,000 times before. "I've picked up scattered things before, Doctor. Usually under worse conditions." She turned and walked away before he could respond, moving through the nurse's station with the kind of fluid grace that made the other staff members turn and watch her go. Sterling stared at the perfectly organized charts, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite form. The attending beside him made a small noise in his throat, not quite approval, not quite disapproval, but something in between that registered as deeply unsettling. What he didn't know was that Katie's heart rate hadn't elevated. Her hands hadn't trembled. The tears had been strategic, a tool as precise and calculated as any weapon she had ever carried. What Dr. Sterling saw as weakness was actually armor. What he interpreted as compliance was actually reconnaissance. She was learning his patterns, his rhythms, the specific way he operated within the system he had built. Knowledge was a luxury in her line of work, and she was gathering it methodically, piece by piece. By 2,100 hours that evening, Katie was working the night shift, moving through the dimmed hallways of Mercy General like a ghost, checking vitals, monitoring monitors, sliding between rooms with the kind of efficient silence that made her nearly invisible. She paused at the door to room 14, where Commander James Riker lay restless in bed, his monitors showing an elevated heart rate of 118, his skin sheened with sweat despite the cool temperature of the room. His hand kept moving to his chest, to the surgical site where they had repaired the injuries from Marja, and Katie noted everything in her head, the distressed breathing pattern, the way his blood pressure was trending upward, the slight audio muffling in his cardiac sounds when she listened with her stethoscope. She documented it all in his chart, precise and clinical, but when she mentioned it to the night shift attending, he barely glanced up from his computer. "Dr. Sterling's patient," the attending said flatly. "Don't touch anything without his approval." Katie nodded and stepped back. But her jaw tightened, just slightly. At 21:30, Sterling appeared on the unit, moving with the kind of confident authority that came from never having his decisions questioned. He reviewed Riker's chart with Katie standing beside him, watching his expression, watching the way his eyes skipped over the vital sign trends that should have concerned him. When he looked at her, his gaze was cold and transactional. "This patient's insurance status is questionable," Sterling said quietly, the words meant for her alone. "Document everything, but keep interventions minimal. We don't need liability exposure." Katie nodded without speaking. her composure held like stone. But in that moment, she understood exactly what was happening and exactly how far he was willing to go to protect his arrangements. She watched him walk away, and she made a decision that would echo across the next 12 hours. At 0200 hours, Riker's monitor alarm chirped, not loud, just the soft notification sound set for the night shift, the kind of sound designed not to wake sleeping patients 3 rooms away. Katie was at the desk reviewing charts when the pattern registered in her peripheral awareness. She moved to his room in 3 seconds. Muffled heart sounds. Rising venous pressure trending on the monitor. Blood pressure dropping from 138 to 122 to 106. She knew the diagnosis before she placed the stethoscope to his chest. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid building in the pericardial sac. Pressure rising. His heart was drowning. She paged the night attending stat and waited exactly 90 seconds before heading to the patient's room to prepare. At 0245, she found the attending standing outside Riker's room with 5 doctors from Sterling's surgical team, 2 residents, 2 fellows, 1 attending. They were standing with their arms crossed, their body language already decided, already resigned. Dr. Sterling called, the night attending said quietly, avoiding Katie's eyes. Says the patient's insurance won't cover emergency procedures. Says you've fabricated care concerns before and we should document carefully before intervening. Katie stared at the 5 doctors standing in a wall between her and a man whose name was tattooed on her forearm in letters she hadn't been allowed to acknowledge for 2 years. Through the window of room 14, she could see Riker's lips going dusky, the color draining from his face as his cardiac output collapsed. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 71%. 68%. 64%. He needs pericardiocentesis now, Katie said, her voice dropping to the register that made people listen without quite knowing why. Or he dies in the next 4 minutes. The senior resident shook his head, the gesture almost apologetic, almost sympathetic. Not our liability. Wait for cardiology consult in the morning. All 5 doctors turned and walked away down the corridor in perfect formation, leaving Katie standing alone outside the room, watching through the glass as a Navy SEAL commander, her commander, began to circle the drain. And then the room's monitor alarm went critical. The hallway at 0300 hours belonged to the machines. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm behind closed doors. For pumps beeped in soft staccato. The fluorescent lights hummed a frequency that felt like pressure behind the eyes. Katie Morrison moved through Mercy General's night shift with the kind of invisibility that came from knowing exactly how to disappear into a uniform. 2 weeks in, and she had already learned which corners of the corridor had dead zones in the security cameras, which supply closets smelled of rust and old linens, which attending physicians could be found at what hour. 3rd floor. West Wing. Room 14. That was where Commander James Riker lay. She pushed into his room without knocking, a small privilege that night shift granted, the assumption that anyone walking at this hour had a reason, had authority, had permission. Riker's monitor told the story before her eyes finished adjusting to the blue-green glow of the screens. His heart rate sat at 118, climbing. Blood pressure elevated at 156/94. Respiratory rate 24 and rising. On the bedside, his surgical drain, a small plastic tube running from under his surgical site to a collection bulb, sat kinked at an unnatural angle, twisted like a snake caught mid-strike. Katie's jaw tightened, but her breath remained even. Not trembling. Never trembling. She moved to his bedside. Riker's skin was slick with sweat, his face flushed with the particular distress of someone whose body was beginning to fail and whose mind was too compromised to understand why. He thrashed against the sheets, fighting something only he could see. The concussion from his extraction in Marja had left him fragmented, pieces of him scattered across time zones and memory. He didn't recognize her. His eyes, when they opened, saw only a nurse. Not Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. Not the woman who had carried him through 200 meters of Taliban crossfire. Just a uniform. Katie straightened the drain with careful fingers. It uncurled like a fist releasing. But the damage was done. Fluid had been building around his heart for minutes, maybe longer. She checked his vital signs again. The numbers had gotten worse. The surgical drain functioned only when it flowed freely, and now his pericardium was filling with blood that should have drained hours ago. Cardiac tamponade. The classic progression was predictable: rising pressure, dropping output, collapse. She had maybe minutes before his blood pressure tanked completely, before his compensatory mechanisms gave out, before the monitor showed her what she could not allow to happen. Katie left the room and moved down the corridor toward the nursing station. The night shift attending should have been paged already. Should have been standing by Riker's room, reading the same vital signs, seeing the same trajectory. She found him at 0305, Dr. Chen, sorting through labs at the computer station. But he wasn't alone. 5 surgeons from Sterling's team stood near the window, speaking in the careful, measured tones of men who had already made a decision they felt comfortable defending. His circling, Chen said without looking up. Drains kinked. Needs emergency evaluation. One of the 5 surgeons, tall, with the kind of polished confidence that came from never having been told no, shook his head. Sterling called us. Insurance verification came back problematic. Medicaid with a notation. No clear coverage on the cardiac intervention rider. Katie's voice was steady. His vitals are dropping. Another surgeon turned to face her. Sterling was very clear. Quote, that floor nurse has fabricated care concerns before. Overreacts to normal post-operative findings. She's new, doesn't understand the difference between a blip and a crisis. The surgeon said this with the tone of someone reading from an email, detaching himself from the content through the act of relaying it. His oxygen saturation is at, Katie checked her mental clock, recalculated the trajectory. 91% and dropping. The third surgeon crossed his arms. Call Sterling directly if you're concerned. He's the attending. He makes the call, not us. I'm calling this as a nurse. His pericardial space is filling. He needs decompression now. The fourth surgeon, younger, maybe 30, his face not yet fully formed into the shape that institutional power gives, said nothing. He just looked away. The fifth one spoke, his voice thin and apologetic, the voice of a man already defeated. We can't. You understand? If we touch that case and his insurance denies coverage, we're liable. Sterling explained that very specifically. Katie looked at each of them in sequence. 5 men. 5 surgeons with 7 figures in combined experience. 7 degrees between them. Probably 400 patient procedures in their collective histories. And they were walking away. She watched them move down the hallway in a formation that would have been absurd if it weren't so choreographed, so perfectly synchronized, like soldiers following an order they had already internalized before it was given. I'll stay with him, Chen said quietly, still not looking at her. But I'm not interventionist. I'm only night shift coverage. I don't have privileges for cardiac procedures. Not in this hospital. Katie turned and walked back toward room 14. The monitors grew louder as she approached, not physically louder, but somehow the sound had compressed, concentrated, like all of Mercy General had been folded into the space of one room's alarm. Riker's oxygen saturation had dropped to 91%. Then, as she watched the screen from the doorway, she saw it tick down again. 89%. The monitor's alarm was on silent, a Mercy, probably, or a protocol designed to prevent panic in the night hours. Katie thought of Marja. Thought of the clinic. Thought of holding Riker's weight while round snapped off tile walls and the world was nothing but velocity and sound and the absolute certainty that stopping meant dying. Her hands were not shaking. She had trained extensively for that. The ultrasound machine sat in the corner of the room, gathering dust. Katie wheeled it to Riker's bedside, moved past him, past the monitors, past the doubt that was trying to form in the space where her surgical training lived. The crash cart was 2 rooms down. She returned with what she needed, a 16-gauge needle, a syringe, betadine swabs, gauze, tape. She set them on the bedside table with a sound like a prayer, the small clink of medical instruments finding their place. "Commander," she said, her voice shifting down an octave, accessing a register she hadn't used in 14 months. "I need you with me. Can you hear me?" Riker's eyes opened. Confused. Struggling against the morphine and the concussion and the sheer weight of whatever his compromised nervous system was telling him about his own failing body. "I've done this before," Katie said. "I've done this in conditions you can't imagine. You're going to be fine. But you need to hold very still for me. Can you do that?" She didn't wait for an answer. She prepped his chest with betadine in smooth circular strokes, the motion familiar as breathing, the muscle memory absolute and unthinking. She positioned the ultrasound probe on his ribs, found the pericardial space on screen, watched the dark fluid collection surrounding his heart like a threat. The needle advanced in her hand, not her hand, really, but an extension of something older and harder than thought. Riker gasped as the needle entered his chest. Not a scream, just the involuntary response of a body recognizing intrusion. Katie's eyes stayed fixed on the ultrasound screen, watching the needle tip approach the fluid, seeing in real time as the membrane of the pericardium gave way and the needle's bevel entered the space where the blood had gathered. She aspirated gently with the syringe. Dark blood. 50 cubic centimeters. 100. She kept pulling, kept withdrawing, kept her focus locked on the monitor and the numbers, heart rate dropping as pressure released, oxygen saturation climbing back up through the 90s, blood pressure rising as his heart could finally fill and pump again. 150 cubic centimeters. 200 total. His breathing eased. The color came back to his face. The monitors, all of them, the ones that had been screaming silently, began to settle into a rhythm that approximated life. Katie withdrew the needle, applied pressure with gauze, and held it there while her own heart finished catching up with the emergency that had just passed. Riker stared at her face, his concussed mind grasping for something just at the edge of cognition, a shape in the dark that refused to come fully into focus. "I know you," he whispered. His voice cracked. "I know your face." "From where?" Katie finished her documentation without answering. She checked the drain, now flowing freely, the kink straightened, the pressure released. She cleaned the ultrasound probe with practiced efficiency, returned the equipment to the corner, and made her way back to the nursing station at 03 for 7 hours. Her hands had not trembled once. Her voice had not wavered. The night shift attending had left a note on the desk, "Great work stabilizing him. I'll monitor overnight." But there was also an email, flagged in red, timestamp 03 for 2 hours, from Human Resources. Report to administration at 0800 regarding patient care concerns. This is mandatory. Bring all shift reports from the past 7 days. At 0600, Dr. Sterling arrived at Mercy General 40 minutes earlier than was normal, before the hospital fully woke, before most staff had finished their coffee in the break room. Katie watched from the nursing station as he entered his office, closed the door, and made 3 phone calls in succession. His hand gestures were animated, pointed, accusatory. He held up papers, tapped them against his desk, nodded with the particular satisfaction of a man who had anticipated the outcome and arranged for it in advance. The hallway hummed. The monitors beeped. Commander Riker slept without nightmares, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 97%, his heart protected now, his blood pressure stable, his drain running clear. In 14 minutes, his cardiac function had moved from crisis to recovery. In the moment after that, the consequences began their slow, inexorable approach, like distant thunder that had already decided where to strike. At 0300 hours, the cardiac monitor began its slow descent into chaos. The drain Katie had placed beside Commander Riker's heart had kinked, a twist in the plastic tubing no wider than a coffee straw, but enough to dam the flow of fluid that should have been draining freely into the collection chamber. Pressure was building. She could see it in the monitor's trajectory, in the way his blood pressure was dropping like a stone down a well. She could feel it in the way the room had begun to hold its breath. Katie moved through the darkened unit with a kind of quiet authority that made night shift residents step aside without being asked. She pulled the ultrasound machine herself, didn't call for a technician, didn't wait for permission, didn't ask Sterling's ghost of a phone call to stop her. The transducer was cool against her gloved fingers as she placed it across Riker's chest. The image materialized on the small screen, his heart, a grayscale fist clenching against an ocean of fluid that should never have been there. 200 milliliters. Maybe more. Pericardial effusion compressing the right ventricle like a vice made of his own blood. The needle was already in her hand. 16-gauge angiocath, the same gauge she'd used 6 years ago in a shot-out clinic compound outside Marja with nothing but moonlight and a dying Marine officer named Riker whose blood had been spilling into the pericardial sac faster than her hands could work. Muscle memory didn't fade. It lived in the tendons. It lived in the part of the brain that didn't require permission to save a life. She didn't ask the 5 surgeons standing outside the room. She didn't wait for Sterling's word to arrive on the night shift attending's phone, the way it had. She'd heard Sterling's call, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, measured and deliberate as he explained to each of the 5 doctors why this patient was a liability. Insurance issues. Questionable financial status. A floor nurse claiming complications that might not exist. One doctor had actually laughed. Another had said, "Not on this case," and walked away with his hands up like he was done, like a patient didn't require saving if the paperwork looked too complicated. Katie's hands moved on their own. They always did. The space between Riker's 5th and 6th ribs opened under her fingers like a door she'd learned to unlock in a place where medicine happened in the dark with a flashlight clenched between someone's teeth and prayer the only anesthesia available. The needle slid in with a kind of precision that came from having already done this when the cost of failure was measured in lives, not lawsuits. The plastic cannula found the fluid immediately, the hiss of blood escaping the pericardium, that sound like air being released from a tire, but rhythmic and vital and absolutely necessary. She drew the plunger back. 10 milliliters. 20. 40. The dark fluid moved through the syringe like something alive, something angry, something that had been waiting in the wrong place to wreak havoc. 100 milliliters. At the 150 milliliter mark, Riker's oxygen saturation began to climb from the basement where it had been sitting at 68%. 69. 72. 80. The sound of the monitor changed, less frantic, more rhythmic, the kind of sound that meant the heart could expand again, could do its job, could push blood where blood needed to go. By the time she'd drawn 200 cubic centimeters, his heart rate had stabilized and his blood pressure was climbing like someone had finally removed the boot from his chest. She taped the catheter in place and stepped back. One of the surgeons outside the room was staring at her through the glass with his mouth slightly open, the expression of a man watching someone perform a procedure that should have required a doctor, a team, authorization. The night shift attending was pale. The remaining 4 doctors had already disappeared down the hallway like they'd never been there at all. By 0700 hours, before Katie's shift had even officially ended, Sterling's network had activated with the precision of a military operation. 3 phone calls made to 3 medical school classmates, men whose careers had been built alongside his in the careful ecosystem of hospital politics and professional advancement. The first call reported that Katie's references were fabricated. The second mentioned substance abuse concerns. The third casually noted erratic behavior and poor clinical judgment. Each call was a seed planted in the careful soil of professional reputation, designed to take root before anyone had time to think too clearly about what had actually happened in that room at 0300. An investigator from the State Nursing Board arrived at 0730. He was a man Sterling knew personally from a hospital fundraiser 3 years ago, a man with the kind of neutral expression that suggested he'd been doing this work long enough to know that most accusations carried at least a kernel of truth. He carried a folder. He carried a pen. He carried the kind of authority that made even competent nurses suddenly unsure of their own hands. Katie sat in a windowless room at 0800, the fluorescent light overhead humming its electric monotone. The HR director, a woman whose name Katie had learned was Patricia Chen, slid a manila folder across the table with both hands, as if it were heavy. Maybe it was. "We've received multiple complaints about your clinical judgment," Patricia said, and her voice held the careful tone of someone reading a script someone else had written. Scope of practice violations. Dr. Sterling reports you performed an invasive cardiac procedure without physician supervision. Katie didn't blink. She didn't shift in her seat. She'd been trained by people whose lives depended on her ability to stay perfectly still under pressure, to keep her voice level when everything inside wanted to scream. I performed pericardiocentesis on a patient in extremis. Each word was measured, clipped, delivered like a tactical report. 5 physicians refused care. Commander Riker would be dead without intervention. The state board is investigating. Patricia's face was carefully neutral, the mask of someone who'd learned not to let emotion show. Pending resolution, we're terminating your employment. Effective immediately. The words landed softly. There was no drama in them. That was the cruelest part. There were no raised voices, no accusations hurled, no injustice announced in thunder. Just a folder and a statement, and a career ending like a door closing quietly in an empty hallway. At 1,600 hours, security met Katie at the locker room. The guard, a man named Dobson who'd always nodded at her in the hallway, held a cardboard box with both hands. His eyes didn't meet hers. That was when Katie understood this wasn't personal. This was just the job he'd been assigned. Her stethoscope went into the box first. The one she'd carried since corpsman training, the diaphragm worn smooth from 10 years of listening to hearts and lungs and the small sounds of people trying to stay alive. Then the mug. Someone had given it to her on her last day at the clinic in Marja, a cracked ceramic thing that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. A half-dead succulent. A joke gift from a resident who'd since transferred to pediatrics. And the photo. 8 faces. Desert camouflage. Marja, 2010, printed on the back in handwriting she recognized as her own. 3 of those faces had small crosses drawn next to them in black pen. Khalid's face. Martinez's face. Patterson's face. The ones who hadn't made it to the helicopter. Katie stood at the bus stop in the rain, the cardboard box growing soggy in her hands. Water dripped from her hair and down her neck. The photo was visible through the plastic sleeve, and her finger found the faces of the dead without her permission, tracing across the plastic like she could change what had happened through sheer will. For the first time in 7 years, her composure cracked. One sob escaped, just one, sharp and sudden, before she controlled it, pulled air into her lungs, wiped her face clean, and straightened her shoulders as the bus pulled up to the curb with a hiss of hydraulic brakes. The bus driver didn't look at her. Nobody ever did. That was the whole point of disappearing. That was the whole point of being declared dead. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was 3 days later when she came back to collect her final paycheck and the entire architecture of her hidden life began to collapse like a building struck at its foundation. 3 days later, Katie pushed through the glass doors of Mercy General wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a grey jacket, moving like she was just another visitor crossing the lobby. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that flat institutional white that made time feel suspended. Her paycheck was waiting in HR. That was all. That was the plan. Slip in, collect what was owed, disappear back into the void where Naval Special Warfare Command had already erased her. But the ER had other ideas. The ambulance doors slammed open at precisely 1,447 hours, and a stretcher rolled through with paramedics calling out vitals that made 3 nurses look up simultaneously, gunshot wound to the right flank, entry only, conscious and combative, refusing treatment, repeating something in Pashto. Katie froze at the edge of the waiting room. She shouldn't have. She should have kept walking. But something in the way the man on that stretcher moved, the rigid tenseness of someone trained in violence, the eye scanning for exits even through pain, made her stop. The patient's eyes locked onto hers across 30 feet of humming fluorescent space. His body convulsed against the stretcher restraints. His voice came out like a rifle crack, "Sheetan Sananam Riki. The American devil woman. She killed Khalid with her hands. She carried the commander through the fire. Through the fire. His words spiraled into Pashto, a language Katie had been legally forbidden to speak for 7 years, a language that had lived in her muscles and her nightmares and nowhere else on this earth. The paramedics exchanged confused glances. 2 nurses reached for sedation. The Taliban fighter, because that's what he was, because Katie's hands knew exactly what his tattoos meant, what the scarring on his knuckles meant, how many people he'd killed in Marja, began thrashing harder, his body a language of recognition and terror that made the entire room go utterly still. And then a small voice, steady and certain, "Senior Chief." Katie turned. Commander James Riker's 12-year-old daughter stood in the corridor entrance, still wearing her school blazer, her face transformed by wide eyes that somehow held no confusion at all. Just recognition. Just the kind of certainty that only comes when a child knows they're standing in front of someone their father loves enough to die for. Senior Chief Morrison. The room went dead silent. Katie's hands moved to her sides, and in that movement, that single shift from visitor to presence, something in the hospital's architecture fundamentally changed. The paramedics felt it. The nurses felt it. The Taliban fighter felt it enough to stop screaming. Riker's voice came next, from behind the girl, rough and gasping from his hospital bed for rooms down the corridor. "Morrison." Katie didn't answer. She moved instead, her gait changing from civilian shuffle to a walk that made her shoulders square, her breathing steady, her eyes forward. She walked past the stretcher where the Taliban fighter was now silent, staring at her with the specific terror of a man who had just understood that his own God had not abandoned him but had sent him to die anyway. She walked past the nurses who suddenly looked very young. She walked to the doorway where Riker's daughter stood, and then into his room. Commander Riker was half-sitting, his chest tube still in place, his color still gray from 3 days of recovery, his hands shaking so hard the four tugged at his wrist. His eyes found hers and locked. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Riker's jaw worked, and his voice came out broken, Navy Cross. "For dragging me out under fire." His hands shook harder. "Bronze Star with Valor." "For holding that clinic alone." His voice cracked. "2 Purple Hearts. 1 for the shrapnel in your back, and 1 for..." He couldn't finish. Katie stood absolutely still, and in that stillness, something gave way inside Riker that must have been held together by 7 years of not understanding, 7 years of carrying a tattoo on his arm that said Morrison but belonged to a ghost. The door opened again, quietly. An FBI liaison in a dark suit and an expression that said she'd seen too many secrets. Behind her, 2 more federal badges that made the nurses stop pretending to work. The liaison's voice was measured, professional, but underneath it ran the current of something that had been classified until approximately 90 minutes ago, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison. "Yes." Declared killed in action, Operation Marja Extract, August 2012. Your records were scrubbed at the direction of Naval Special Warfare Command. Your existence has been officially denied for 7 years. Congratulations, your cover is now blown. Riker's daughter reached out and took Katie's hand. "You really did carry him out." Katie looked at this child who shouldn't know that, who must have overheard conversations meant to stay classified, who was now holding her hand like Katie was made of something solid. "Yes." The liaison continued, "Dr. Sterling is being removed from premises within the hour. He's been flagged for insurance fraud review, Medicare billing violations, and obstruction of medical treatment. The state nursing board investigator who filed that complaint against you has been suspended pending ethics review. 3 of his medical school classmates have been contacted by Navy JG regarding statements they made about your credentials." Katie barely heard it. Her attention had narrowed to Riker's hands, which had stopped shaking now because his daughter had climbed onto his hospital bed and was resting her head against his shoulder, neither of them looking away from Katie. Security arrived at 1,603 hours. Not for Katie. For Dr. Sterling. He came walking down the corridor with his briefcase and his Italian shoes and his $12,000 Rolex, apparently still under the impression that he was a person who got to walk through this hospital. Security met him at the intersection of corridors, and the guard, the same one who had handed Katie her termination box 3 days ago, held out an identical cardboard container. "Your personal items, Dr. Sterling. I believe you know the way out." Sterling's face did something then that Katie had never seen it do. It crumpled. Not in anger. In the specific terror of a man watching his entire life become something he could hold in a box. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked at the box like it was a coffin. He looked at the security guard like he was looking for mercy, for reconsideration, for some indication that this was reversible. The guard's face was professional and immovable as a stone. Sterling took the box. His hands were shaking, actually shaking, not from restraint but from the understanding that every network he had called, every favor he had owed, every relationship he had weaponized had evaporated the moment someone with real authority started asking questions. His former allies were suddenly unavailable. His phone calls were unreturned. His law school classmates were explaining they'd misunderstood what they'd said about Katie's credentials. The hospital board had discovered, in approximately 7 hours, exactly $340,000 in billing irregularities, phantom procedures, inflated equipment costs, and what looked very much like kickback arrangements. The FBI wasn't even the threat to Sterling. The Navy JG was. Katie watched him walk toward the exit. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The Taliban fighter in the ER for rooms away was screaming again, but this time it was just pain, not recognition, not the specific horror of seeing justice move with the kind of speed that only military authority could provide. Sterling pushed through the automatic doors and disappeared. The fluorescent lights hummed their institutional hum. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. And from Riker's room, Katie could hear his daughter's voice, "Tell me again how you got him to the helicopter." 6 months later, Katie Morrison stood in the trauma unit of the VA Medical Center in Norfolk, wearing her dress blues with her anchors pinned to her collar, her name tag reading Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, USN, Ret. Her hands that had held men together with nothing but muscle memory and refusal to quit, moved with the same precision they always had, placing central lines with the fluid certainty of someone for whom medical crisis was simply another variant of a problem she'd already solved 100 times before in worse conditions. On her first day back, Riker walked through the unit doors. He was moving better now, the pain medications minimal, his breathing steady. But he carried something, a framed photograph, mounted with precision, a plaque engraved below it. In the photo, Katie stood in full combat gear, covered in blood that wasn't all hers, carrying Riker's body toward a helicopter. Her face held the kind of focus that had no name in civilian language. Absolute refusal. Absolute commitment. Absolute will. The plaque read, Senior Chief Katie Morrison, USN, when others walked away. Riker and his daughter and 2 other men in naval dress blues stood in the hospital lobby while hospital administrators, while federal agents, while local press, while 30 veterans in various states of uniforms and wheelchairs and prosthetics watched that photograph get mounted on the lobby wall. Riker stood at attention, his hand steady, and pinned Katie's retirement shadow box beside it, medals arranged in ascending order of prestige. Navy Cross at the top. Everything else below it. Katie accepted every medal. Every commendation. Every statement of recognition. She stood at attention while her daughter played the national anthem on a violin, while Riker spoke about extraction operations and refusal to quit and people who asked no questions before they saved your life. She let herself be seen, finally, in the light. That evening, after the ceremony, after the speeches, after the press had gone home and the lobby had quieted down, Riker found her alone in the staff break room, holding a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. "I got this in Germany," he said, rolling up his sleeve. The Morrison tattoo was still there, faded now, but permanent. "While I was recovering. I couldn't remember your face, but I couldn't forget your name." He looked at her directly, and his eyes held 7 years of gratitude that had nowhere to go until now. "I always knew you'd come back, Senior Chief." Katie touched the tattoo gently, her finger tracing the letters. "I never left, Commander. Just changed uniforms." Across the city, in a fluorescent-lit grocery store parking lot, Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table wearing a polo shirt with someone else's name embroidered on it, handing out insurance quotes to people who would not make eye contact. A woman walked past, recognized his face from a news segment about hospital fraud, and said to her companion, "That's the doctor who tried to let that seal die." Sterling stared at his hands. They'd stopped shaking weeks ago. What remained was worse, the absolute clarity that he had been correct about one thing: there were people in this hospital who understood the difference between survival and sacrifice. He'd just chosen the wrong side. Back at the VA, the photograph remained illuminated in the hospital lobby long after the ceremony ended. Katie Morrison in full battle dress, absolutely covered in blood, carrying Commander Riker toward salvation. Every shift change, every arriving patient, every visiting family member saw that image and understood without words what it meant to refuse. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of heroes who change everything. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real story. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were absolutely, completely wrong? And tell me, what would you have done if you were standing in that ER when 5 doctors walked away?